Now we're going to learn about destructuring along with arrow functions and let and const is probably something you're going to be using every single day. I find them to be extremely useful in the code that I'm writing. So what does destructuring mean? It allows us, or it's a JavaScript expression that allows us to extract data from arrays, objects, and something called maps and sets, which we're going to learn about in a future video, into their own variable. So it allows us to extract properties from an object or items from an array, multiple at a time. So let's take a look at what problem this really solves. So sometimes you need to have like top level variables like const name or first equals person dot first, const last equals person dot last. And you get the point. You do this over and over and over again, and you've got this pretty much just repetitive code over and over again where you need to make a variable from something that is inside of an object or inside of an array. So what we could do instead of doing two variables or six, you could say const and you open up a curly bracket, and that is not a block. That is not an object. It's the destructuring syntax. We say first, last equals what? Person. Now, what does that do? That says, give me a variable called first, a variable called last, and take it from the person. So it's kind of weird because we're not setting the entire object, but we're taking the first property and the last property and putting them into two top level variables. So if I save that now and I say first and last, you see that we get Wes and boss because I've created two top level variables. Similarly, if I also wanted Twitter, I would just add Twitter into that and I would get a third top level variable that inside of my actual scope. So that's really handy in many use cases. This is just one nested level, but for example, in React, you want to use destructuring because the data is so deeply nested. So let's take a look at some nested data here. So I'm going to make another variable down here called Wes, and we got first, last, but now this data is like something you might get back from an API where it's really deeply nested. And I want to be able to pull out Twitter and Facebook URLs here. And I could do this like const Twitter equals wes.links.social.twitter. And then we also want Facebook. So I would just add Facebook and I'm off and running. But again, that's really annoying. We can use destructuring to do it one better. We just say const, open and close your curly brackets there to open and close the destructuring syntax. And we'll say Twitter and Facebook are going to be equal to, and we don't just say Wes here, we say wes.links.social, and that will then reach into the social object and pull out two variables called Twitter and Facebook. Now, I just consted Twitter, and I did that up here as well. You can see my editor is getting all red and mad at me because I used that variable already, so I'm just going to comment that out. And it's good. Now, if I look at Twitter, you see the link to my actual Twitter. So that is how you do it with nested data. Let's take a look at another use case, which would be renaming your variables. So sometimes the data comes back in like some odd names, and you might not necessarily want to use the property key. Like for example, here, I already used Twitter as a variable. I can't use it again, but I'm kind of stuck because this object gives me Twitter as a key, and this object gives me Twitter as a key. So what you can do is you can rename them as you destructure them. So you can say, I want the Twitter property, but I want to call it tweet. And I want the Facebook property, but I want to call it FB. That's my snippet text expander. I want to call it FB. And let's see here. Now we've got my tweet variable and I have my FB variable, and they are being destructured as wes.links.social.facebook, but then stored in a variable called FB and stored in an actual variable called tweet. There's one last thing we need to know about destructuring objects, and that is the ability to set defaults. This one's a little bit confusing, so bear with me here, and we're going to circle back for another example later on in a couple of videos with a function. So let's say we have like a function that's going to do some animation on our page, and it's going to create an element and style it for us. So we have things like width, height, color, and font size that we want to set on this actual element. So we have that settings object. Now, I'm going to create my own settings. So say settings equals, and we want the width to be 300 and we want the color to be black, right? So those are our settings. However, the thing that we're building also requires a height and a font size. So those are the four properties that the thing that we're building requires. Now, how do we actually deal with them when they're not in there? Now, previously what you do is you sort of have like a default settings object, and then you would fold this one in, you would merge it on in. But with ES6, what we can do is we change that to const, and we can create our variables here. So I'm going to say const width, height, color, font size equals, and then in here we are going to say settings, because that's this variable. So what that's going to do is it's going to pick out the width and it's going to pick out the color from our settings. But what about height and font size? They haven't been set in settings, so they're going to be undefined, and that's going to be a bit of a problem for us. So what you can do is when you do your destructuring, you can also set sort of a fallback or a default value. So maybe width is default 100, height is default to 100 as well, color is default to blue, and font size is default to 25. Now what's going to happen is this destructuring works like this. Width, is it in the set? Is it being destructured from the settings object? Yes. So width is going to be 300. Height, is that being destructured from the settings object? No, it's not in there. So it's going to roll back to the default 100. Color, is that in there? Yes. So blue will not be used. Black will win over. And font size, that's not in there. So we will use the default. So if I open this up in my browser here, we should be able to see like the width is 300. Good. So the settings took over. But like, let's look at height, which is not in the settings object. So it's 100 because the default has sort of fallen in. And where this is going to be really useful is when we pass a settings object to a function in just a couple of videos. I know you're asking right now is, Wes, I just learned all this stuff about destructuring, but can we put it all together into one major thing? And I actually wondered that as well. So I came up with this, which is take a look at this, maybe pause it for a second and sort of try to ask yourself what is going on here and what are the variables that are being created. I'm going to go open my DevTools here. What are the variables being created? Well, the variables being created are width and height. Why? Because it's destructuring W and H, but it's renaming them to width and height. So I should be able to type width and I guess I got to save first. Width and height. Good. So it's 800 and 500. So what's happening here is that it's destructuring width from this object here. So it's going to take 800 and then it's immediately renaming it to width. So it's going to be 800. And then height, what are these equals right here? Those are default values. So height, there is no H being passed at all. So H tries to destructure from the object here. It can't. So it falls back to 500 default and then it renames itself to height. So I'm not sure if you would use that every day or maybe even every year, but it's kind of fun to look at and to wrap your head around. It's something that you could maybe write and, I don't know, put it on a t-shirt and be cool. So enjoy that one.